finance minister had an epiphany after listening to the new Conservative leader's plan for ministers to find savings if they want to spend any new money. The only problem is, before COVID, her government ran up $110 billion in debt. Before the Russian invasion, added $500 billion to the debt. $200 billion of that was not even COVID spending. This government would rather blame everyone else than take responsibility for their homegrown inflation issue. How can any Canadian trust this government to fix the inflation crisis they created?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I'm happy to address this member's question. For weeks now, the Leader of the Opposition has considered our pandemic spending frivolous. I respectfully disagree. I think that the Canadians, millions of Canadians who kept their jobs and stayed employed because of the queues disagree. I think the millions of Canadians who were able to feed their children because of the CERB disagree. And I think the hundreds of thousands of businesses whose doors are still open today because of our investments would disagree. Thank goodness we were here, because the Leader of the Opposition doesn't want to lead, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
The Liberals will continue to blame everyone else for their homegrown failures, and these failures are driving Canadians deeper into debt. They cancelled good Canadian energy projects, attacked our farmers, and hit Canadians with a job-killing carbon tax. They drove up inflation, made groceries, gas, and home heating more expensive, driving more Canadians to food banks and homeless shelters at an alarming rate. How can anyone believe that the same government that is pile-driving more Canadians into insolvency will give this economy a soft landing?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy.
Mr. Speaker, in the context of a country where fires, floods, and hurricanes are already devastating our country, that in the context of a time where there is a scientific deadline, a timetable to when we must address climate change, we must make sure that we take these actions so that we don't put future generations of Canadians at risk. Mr. Speaker, I call on that member, the entire opposition, to come with us, come together in this place and figure out a plan like we have to grow the economy, create jobs, and fight climate change.
This government increased the debt by over $100 billion before COVID, then increased the debt another $500 billion during COVID, half of which they didn't even spend on pandemic measures. But now we're supposed to believe the government has a newfound religion called fiscal restraint. If they haven't shown Canadians any fiscal responsibility in 7 years, why should we trust them now?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are a fiscally responsible government. Every single year over the last 7 years that we've been in government, outside of the pandemic, the debt to GDP ratio has gone down. That's while we've invested in Canadians. In fact, the poverty report came out in October. We've lifted millions of Canadians out of poverty. You know what, Mr. Speaker? 25% less seniors live in poverty today than when we took office in 2015, and that's because we're supporting Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, if this government wants to run on its record, it's going to have to own up that its spending has helped drive inflation to 40-year highs, and Canadians are having a hard time putting food on the table. Even the Bank of Canada says that inflation is a homegrown problem. So they promised to keep spending increases now to 2% a year. Has the Deputy Prime Minister told the rest of Cabinet about this new fiscal plan?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we know that inflation is a global problem. Inflation in Canada has come down from its peak to 6.9%, but we know it is 8.2% in the United States. It's over 10% in the Euro area. It's over 10% in the OECD. It's important that we continue to focus on affordability measures. It's going to make life easier for Canadians, like we did by doubling the GST benefit. That's going to 11 million Canadian families that need it, Mr. Speaker, and over 50% of our seniors.
Great revelation today, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance is now taking her inspiration from the speeches of the Leader of the Official Opposition. They finally realized that budgets don't balance themselves, and they're asking ministers to find savings before proposing new programs. Hallelujah, Mr. Speaker. The problem is that they should have done this a lot. They should have been listening to the member for Carleton a lot earlier. They added $100 million to the national debt before COVID. They added $500 billion before the war in Ukraine, Mr. Speaker. $200 billion that had nothing to do with COVID. How can we trust this government to manage inflation that they created? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy that the Conservative member is so interested in correspondence between the Minister of Finance and her colleagues. It's clear that we have a plan that is based on fiscal responsibility, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, we presented a budget that was recognized by all of the experts as being fiscally responsible. And we're seeing the results of that. Our rate of inflation is much lower than that of our colleagues and partners around the world. And we are going to continue to make sure that we are spending in a responsible way. The honourable member for Mégantic L'Érable. Well, let's talk about fiscal responsibility, Mr. Speaker. This Prime Minister said in his first ever speech that interest rates would stay at low levels for decades to come. I remember that promise, Mr. Speaker. He said there's going to be some tiny deficits because we have the means, because interest rates are going to stay low, and it's not a big deal. But they've added $100 billion to the debt before COVID, Mr. Speaker. That's the reality. And now today, they're saying to Canadians, hey, trust us. We're going to manage this crisis. Well, no, Canadians don't trust you anymore. Mr. Speaker, they are no longer capable of managing this crisis. Mr. Speaker, when are you going to get rid of your plan that's hurting Canadians? When will you stop increasing taxes? Once again, I'd like to remind the honourable member that questions must go through the Speaker and not to the Speaker. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do think that my Conservative colleague is a bit overexcited. He's attacking the Bank of Canada and the independence of our financial institutions. Well, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we believe in the independence of our institutions, and it was a Conservative government under Brian Mulroney that put in place the Bank of Canada's targets, and we think that that was a good idea. Thank you.